this entire project, and also for being a beacon of enlightened leadership and the kind of background that you come in from. So now with that, we'll begin the core presentation, and then after that, Neeraj and Chunki will start the focal group discussion, the focus group discussion with everyone, and everyone can then join in and give your inputs on the National Action Plan, Human Rights at the moment, right? So that's what the structure is. So may I ask Rohit to start, and this Chunki, you have something? Yeah.
So this is the report that we came out last time, which is the result of 5-city consultation. I'll leave 2 copies behind the packet. It's the same kind of a thing that we're actually coming out this year as well, but this will incorporate all your views in this to inform the zero draft.
All right, thank you very much, Dean Sudarshan, for your encouragement. Thank you, Mr. Viraf, for outlining how the National Action Plan is supposed to work, so that saves me a bit of trouble. So, of course, this is the ideal aim of the National Action Plan, which is to align Indian businesses to international standards, along with the directives of the UNGP. Of course, through this approach, there are 3 pillars that we're addressing, which is the manner in which states and private actors have to meet and uphold their human rights obligations, if these obligations exist at all, which is something we will try and identify through this presentation. And then, of course, look at methods of relief or redressal that exist. So, considering these 3 pillars, and this being the aim of the NEP, we first think it's important to go ahead and look at the current status that we have in the zero draft. This has already been well summarized today in the talk, but it's 2011 onward that the concept of voluntary reporting was introduced. This is now mandatory as part of the BRR, when you have to talk about the contributions that you are making. This is also governed by the NAFRA, which is your audit or regulatory body, which receives these reports and analyzes them. There are, of course, additionally SEBI requirements that exist. The criticism that we have to this, of course, is all of this exists in the voluntary sphere. It's still very easy to say that we don't do this at all and submit a blank report, or say that this is the very little that we do. In relation to this, of course, when we are targeting big corporations and multinationals in and of itself, these are big impersonal agencies. It's very easy for them to say that this is not something we're interested in and give you a cold shoulder. In particular, if you look at developing states, such as India and other countries which perhaps are not growing economies of the world, countries with GDPs, companies with revenues the size triple, quadruple the times of a nation's GDP, it's incredibly easy to ignore recommendations of this sort. So even though, of course, the idea of the National Action Plan is great, it's following UN directives, the same criticism exists on both planes for these, saying that if these are merely directives and are non-mandatory in nature, what are the effective changes that you can make? And these are not empty concerns that we're putting forth. In fact, there is an important distinction that we must look at when we're talking about human rights and private entities, which is human rights themselves exist in a sphere of law which is fairly unique, wherein these are international obligations that are agreed that we owe to each other, but you owe these to each other as individual human beings and not state actors. So even though all international relations and treaties are run by states on a basis of one state and another, you here address individual residents of these states. So there's an interesting dichotomy that you have there with regard to the application of human rights and how states are meant to uphold them in the first place. Along with this, now if you have the addition of a private body or entity, especially something of the scale of an MNC, there are big questions that are raised as to how and why a human rights mandate should be passed on to these individuals. How do you ensure these individual corporations are upholding them and how it works? Because even if I were to give you an example from the Indian framework, which is to say, Article 14 and 15 of your Constitution prohibit discrimination and uphold the right to equality respectively. And within these, things like open defecation and manual scavenging are things that are prohibited and not allowed for. Yet, for the longest time, the Indian Railways, being an essential body that connects people across the nation and goods, had open defecation toilets. And this is something that is still in the process of being changed. And by 2020, this is a resolution that we might just achieve. So even considering the fact that states in and of themselves have difficulty fulfilling human right mandates, how can we impose additional mandates on private corporations? If we are imposing them, how do we make sure that they are being met? Do we have the necessary expertise to do so? How does this work? And of course, because the human rights framework that has been developed since post-World War II talks about relationships between individuals and the state, how do you include and address private corporations here? You cannot go to a private corporation and say, I have been grieved, I am in distress, what can you do for me? Therefore, human rights as they are currently understood talk about a few things: the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, the freedom of thought and expression of opinion, to a certain extent the right to work and the right to having an education. Now, all of this stems from the idea of human rights being intrinsic to an individual and a part of individual dignity, which in itself is a Kantian concept. And the idea of expanding human rights to questions of access to water, resources, health, so on and so forth, are a natural expansion of these core principles that you've seen. So the idea that we've seen in this country, for example, is the expansion of human rights or fundamental rights under Article 21, which is the right to life, which has gradually included things like the right to food, the right to shelter and housing. These are small incremental expanses that have been made by state agencies, whether that is the judiciary or the legislature. You have not had private bodies that have been making an effort or at least a noticeable change. And because of the manner in which human rights frameworks operate, it is difficult to make private bodies accountable here. So right now I'd like to bring you to the framework of grievances that you might have when you address private corporations. When you address a private corporation, you go to the Consumer Redressal Forum and you say that this was poorly advertised, misrepresented, the product was not what it seems, it is dangerous perhaps, and I need compensation. All of this falls under a broad framework of tort law, which is a private nuisance. There is no claim of fundamental right or human right that you can raise against the corporation and say that I have been wronged, and this is because states are considered to be your guardian of human rights and are meant to uphold them. Therefore, the concern at the onset is, of course, if we are talking about human rights obligations and how they relate to businesses, how are we doing so? There is a requirement of a massive shift in the international order and understanding of human rights if we are to apply this in any noticeable fashion. So at the moment, the idea of having a national action plan seems great, but it's rather quixotic. And to illustrate, if you want to make changes or incrementally expand these rights, there has to be a very, very particular approach that is taken. If we are to look at the Maggie case study, there are two concerns that were raised, which is, number one, there was, what is this? Ajinomoto, sorry, what is that called? Yes. Thank you. So, present in Maggie, which apparently is not part of the ingredients in themselves. However, once the Maggie is cooked, you see the presence of this. Along with this, there were allegations that there was excessive amounts of lead present in the Maggie. Now, both of these were harmful. They went to laboratories, they were tested back and forth, and for the moment, you have no firm conclusions besides the fact that Maggie seems to be safe enough that it's still sold in markets. And the reports issued by the FSSI and other food security organizations have merely stated that among the batches we tested, we discovered these certain amounts, and if lead or are ingested in these amounts, then there is a certain degree of harm that might be caused. The problem here becomes, if you wish to go to Nestle and say that, listen, you have violated my right to food, as in I should be having a healthy meal, you cannot do that because Maggie is not really an essential commodity. It's not part of your basic meal. It's advertised that, 10 rupees ka packet in 2 minutes, you have food, you can eat that, it's affordable, yes, but it is not essential, it is not a healthy meal, and with regard to the development of the right to food in itself, it talks about the fact that it's got to be good, nutritious food that is provided. Maggie doesn't fit these criteria or categories, so you cannot approach them. If you were, and if you really wanted to make this a human rights issue, the best extension or scope that we could see to this is a form of argumentation that comes from a right to bodily autonomy. So something perhaps that is expressed in the medical termination of pregnancy bill, or more recently in the right to privacy judgment that talks about bodily autonomy and the right that you have with regard to how your body is used in many facets and forms. there you can make an argument that really stretches the limits of the right to life, that says, I am ingesting something within my body that has the possibility of causing harm, and therefore my right to bodily autonomy and integrity has been violated, which makes it a fundamental right violation, which turns this into a human rights claim. But this is a massive stretch that has to be made, and it's not something that is easy to make. Very often, there are bodies like the judiciary have stepped in certain cases and made these essential differences. We've had a discussion today about how frameworks regarding sexual harassment in the workplace have developed over the years, and it was the Indian judiciary in the Vishaka guidelines that came up with the conception of an unsafe work environment, which said that if I don't have a work environment wherein I feel safe to work or operate in, this would also constitute as a form of sexual discrimination that I'm facing, and therefore becomes a fundamental right violation, which translates to a violation of human rights. But as you can see, this is a very, very clear development of a new doctrine that's taking place, a new expression of the conception of the right to life that's been extended in the Vishaka guideline. These are steps that, frankly, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, which is spearheading this project, might not be in the best position to make. And if we are today concerned about the development of human rights in this country and the way businesses can contribute, there's one thing that we have to realize, that the Indian government might be concerned about things like sustainability, but it doesn't really care about human rights. Things like AFSPA still exist. Kashmir has been under a lockdown for over 2 months, and in fact, if we are to talk about business responsibilities, with the slow lifting of the ban on communications, people found out that they've been billed for 2 months of cell phone usage for something they couldn't use. But it's important to note, therefore, that the Indian state per se isn't really concerned about matters of human rights at large. Therefore, if the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is involving itself in such an endeavor and is planning to work with big corporations, the first criticism that we would have is this: with regard to the formation of a national action plan that's targeting and trying to regulate big corporations, India is not the only country that's trying to do this. The UN guidelines exist as a policy framework for the world at large to follow. And therefore, there are probably other jurisdictions which have better developed laws. For example, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States states that if you're trying to sell Maggi there, you cannot claim on your packet that it doesn't contain additives, because it's not simply a fact of the matter that it doesn't exist while it's being sold but being cooked. But these are distinctions that the Indian law doesn't make. So there are better developed frameworks and regulatory bodies in other jurisdictions, and frankly, there are corporations that are run with a better spirit in mind, wherein these claims are already being looked into and moderated at a global scale. Therefore, a particular focus in India would probably just result in a question of over-regulation in an industry which is already well regulated. But the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is not only responsible for the organized sector, but also the unorganized sector. If it is essential to create a discourse on human rights and why it matters, it might be a better idea to not only focus on small and medium enterprises, but to pay attention to your local chaiwala and see whether they're employing children or not. Because what is essential in the beginning here is not questions of punishment or redressal or what frameworks you have in mind, because these are corporations with big pockets. They have money and they can pay their fines and get out of this. The impetus that must be made here in terms of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs doing anything is to develop a spirit that really cares about human rights on the ground level. Without the development of the necessity and importance of human rights at a grassroots level, there is not much of a change that we foresee. Additionally, if the drive here is to make human rights a focus of corporate social responsibility, CSR, great idea. It hasn't worked really well in implementation. Of course, you're supposed to contribute about 2% of your profits, and this is, of course, if you are a profit-making company in the first place. But you're free to determine among the broad parameters that have been given exactly where and how you would like to contribute to CSR. So it's not that CSR works in targeted areas where it's required, where intervention is needed, wherein, for example, you created a job, but the job that you created is rather poor and you don't make a living wage. How can we assist you in that fashion? This is not how CSR works. It's not targeted in that fashion. For example, L&T Larsen & Toubro was one of the firms in charge of the creation of the Statue of Unity. Among their CSR contributions, their entire 2% for 2 years was dedicated completely to the funding of this project. So there is, of course, the idea of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and private corporations working together with one another with other long-term profit-making goals in mind. And this, of course, brings us to the central concern about why on earth we are trying to regulate these bodies and saddle them with human rights concerns when the fundamental basis of corporate law and the way companies operate are based on memorandums of association and articles of association, which clearly, in the eyes of the law, lay out the areas of operation of companies and how far they can work. If a human rights mandate doesn't exist within there, it's not within the company's framework, nor is the company expected to do so. Lastly, if you are trying to have companies adhere to human rights networks and hold them accountable and say you have to develop skills, you have to have reporting, we'd like to know what you're doing, what I in particular see here is a divestment of state responsibility. The state as a whole is responsible for human rights. This seems like a convenient way for the state to say that now that we have so many organizations involved in so many aspects, we would like them to self-regulate, and if they don't self-regulate, we would then hold them accountable. This, very simply put, is a dereliction of duty, and it's a disregard for the human rights that the Indian state and other states have promised to uphold, which is a big concern that we have when you're talking about the imposition of human rights on private corporations. Yes, Professor? Oh yeah, okay, we're almost done. So therefore, a few recommendations that we would have is, of course, closer regulation of corporate social responsibility and how they're working. Also, in terms of the current reporting structure that's there, companies that in the top 100 or top 500 are expected to report and look at the human rights claims that they're raising, kind of contributions that they have made. Instead, what we would propose is, however, picking focus groups for particular industries. It's not necessary that a corporation is at the top of their game in terms of making profits, but in terms of what interventions you're making in what particular fields. If you were to look at the mining sector and you pick 5 mining companies, then you pick 5 fast-moving consumer good corporations, then you have a more targeted network in terms of understanding how different facets of industry affect and operate within a human rights framework and how particular companies are working to address them. This also takes away from the question of just having money or market capitalization that you can use for these questions. So more effective strategies that are being used on the ground by real-life companies might be more effective. Lastly, the question, of course, is of regulation. If you'd like human rights to be upheld or maintained by private corporations, how do you do so? How do you regulate this? And I'd like to give you the example of social media platforms today. And the biggest debate that's raging on social media is whether these are merely publication platforms or they're supposed to be gatekeepers of speech as well. So in terms of the freedom of expression and liberty to say what you will, the question there is who regulates whom, how do these frameworks operate? And there is already crisis there between corporations themselves, the individuals who use them, as well as state agencies and actors who are responsible for these rights, and of course, in many cases have vested interest in how and why opinions are expressed. So it seems on the whole very, very dangerous, in fact, to us, if we were to extend a mandate of human rights to corporations instead of merely looking at questions of enforcement, which is perhaps a good idea. But if we are to broaden the scope of human rights and look at other things, questions of sustainability might be a better focus in terms of this National Action Plan, especially with regard to the fact that the latest guidelines that have been released by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs also tailor very closely to the commitments India made at the Paris Climate Change Summit. So it might be a better idea in terms of a new National Action Plan for accountability of private organizations, and accountability in the form of sustainable development perhaps might be a better focus than trying to assign and prescribe duties and responsibilities in terms of human rights, because this requires firstly a larger breakup of the international framework and then an understanding of how to apply them to large and small corporations alike. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman. So since this is also supposed to be an interdisciplinary input, I wanted to ask whether students with the public policy, international affairs, business, whether you have any very quick comments from your disciplinary perspective. Public policy? Anything that Rohit hasn't covered that you want to speak on? Yeah? So you could just put on the microphone, please. Introduce yourself briefly.
So, one of the questions. So one of the aspects that we come across while reading the Maggie case was the role of FSI as an institution itself. It took one food inspector in Uttar Pradesh to randomly pick up a packet of Maggi and send it for testing. It took a year for the results to come back. When FSI gives its licenses, it's valid for 1 to 5 years depending on the institution itself. Does it recheck the product while it's renewing the licenses? If it does, then how did it not find out that MSG and lead was being used in Maggi itself? And also, so this is one thing that FSI would look into in its role as a regulator. And the second aspect is that regulatory bodies function the best when they are at an arm's length from the government. FSI is further regulated by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So why is the government involved in the regulation? Right? It gives scope for government bias to come in, for its vested interest to come in, because the government also has to balance its revenue generating in its industries and human rights and interests of the people. And thirdly, FSI is headed by a retired government official. Why should it not be headed by a health expert? So these are the three things which we found as an institution FSI could work on. And institutions in general, which pillar 3 of the NAP also focuses on. So institutional strength is something which gives better impetus to how democracy is conducted in the country itself. So the strength of an institution is also something that we as a democracy should be working on.
This is excellent. You haven't told everyone your name and your discipline.
Meghna. I'm a first year public policy student.
Thank you very much, Meghna. Very quickly, the international affairs, the business, any additional comments? Very quickly.
Hi everyone, I'm Divyanshu from International Affairs. So basically, my question would be that the government of India has been trying to pursue better ranking in ease of doing business. And from the global perspective, we have been one of the few countries who have been trying to pursue having a NAP for our country. But it still has to be taken into account that we are still behind many years according to the countries which have already started applying it, and we are trying to catch with them. So we have tried to set a target for 2020, so that means we are going to do it in a way that will be very absurd. So in that, how does it fit the government's agenda if they are going to say that we are going to improve our rankings in ease of doing business, if you are going to enforce rules so that the countries, so that the companies who are going to enforce the regulations to find out the human rights issues in the associated partners, that they have to find out what their associated partners are doing. For example, in the case of Sodexo, what they are doing from how they are getting the vegetables from. So if they have to enforce that, it's going to increase drastically their cost of doing business. So how the countries are going to, how we are going to assimilate in that perspective into our policy.
Great. Thank you very much, Divyanshu. So now I'm going to turn the floor to Dheeraj and to Chunki, whichever way they want to conduct the focus group discussion based on the team presentation, and also then the larger audience. You're absolutely welcome to interject and give your inputs as well. Okay.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Just a couple of things. From the company's perspective, you know that when it was attacked reputationally, and that reputational damage costed billions. So if I was sitting in the company today, or if I was one of its investors, I'd be asking how it managed perception, and how did it allow such a thing to happen, and whether it was already and regularly in touch with regulators, stakeholders, consumers. Sadly, that's not the case. The company doesn't have a stakeholder engagement program. It doesn't regularly talk to you and me. And there's no evidence, and stakeholder engagement is a whole principle there. So if the company wanted not to have all that reputational, spend millions of dollars on salvaging it, what could it have done to prevent that from happening. And there's a whole range of stuff that we could suggest from human rights that a company could have done not to destroy a reputation built up. Another point. Maggi, we know from studies in the hills. What studies in the hills? You walk around the hills and you will see that Maggi is eaten raw by most children, and certainly in Ladakh where I work. Meaning it is taken, crushed, the masala is put into it like chips, you crush it and you eat it. Have you ever seen children doing this?
Yeah.
All right. Secondly, in high altitude places like Ladakh, I'm sorry, water does not boil at 100 degrees to cook anything properly. It boils at 78 degrees and 79 degrees. And Amit and I have a separate discussion about Ladakh. But when you know these things, now, I am not arguing that Maggi is aware or unaware. Let me tell you that they have good intelligence. They probably know that children are eating it raw, or they are incompetent and they don't know, or they do know, but they're doing nothing about it because it might harm. Now, eating Maggi raw, when I talk to doctors and say it is definitely harmful. It should be stopped forthwith. And the company should put a label, a responsible company in the package, do not eat this product uncooked, in simple letters. And the children in the schools, this company has the big pockets to reach out to give an advisory how to use Maggi responsibly. Do boil it, and if you cannot boil it, then X, and do not eat it raw. Now, if you know millions of kids are eating it raw, we are arguing that the human rights system that we are wanting to see prompts a company primarily to do a due diligence of the impact of its product on the health of its primary and most vulnerable users, i.e. children. And if it did that due diligence, it would have discovered elements like eating it raw, which nobody is claiming Maggi is asking the children to do, but it certainly, if it notices a wrong practice in the way that product is being consumed, surely it has an obligation to advise them not to do so and to do so in the correct way. If you ignore that advice at your own risk, that's your own risk. None of this has been done by the company. So when you see no change, and we would argue then, another thing for the group to think about, who is then responsible in which way between the family and the state for the rights of a child? The school is responsible at one level, the family and the siblings are responsible as parents and elders, and the state is responsible through the Children's Commission, the Ministry of Women and Children, etc. Nowhere has the child part been highlighted. It's just a consumer, somebody is eating it. But if we argue that such a vast constituency are consumers who are now actually saying, I want Maggi by name as a child, and I want to eat that. So we have a new powerful proxy consumer. Now, whether the rights of a child are being compromised in the understanding that the full realization of the rights of a child in terms of being able to understand the information, be assured of the safety parameters by their school and their parents, who are the guardians responsible for vulnerable children. And if that information has neither come from the company, from home, or from school, then that child is at risk. Then the company must do something. It's its product. And it will advise companies at the very least, one, the debate on is it harmful or not. And I agree, there's a debate there about, you spelled it out. But if you know somebody is misusing it, that's the same reason you have debates about, people don't kill and guns kill and statements like that in the same breath. That if your product, it's the same reason you can have a bulldozer and I can sell it to a country, but if I knew that the bulldozer, and it's a true story with Caterpillar using supplying particular types of machinery in the West Bank that the Israeli forces could more effectively break Palestinian houses, and that was raised. If a very well-known company makes and sells in Haryana, the state where the worst female infanticide takes place, surely they have an obligation to advise how their machine should be used to detect gender of people. And these are real cases, and companies have paid a very high price for ignoring them. So these are real things. So the child part is unique here because it's a primary targeted consumer, and we have no evidence that the company has reached out to in any way inform or to make sure that children don't, one way or the other, through ignorance or any others, misuse its product or use it in a wrong way, because that is then like a tobacco company saying cigarettes are safe, you know. But they have to print a warning on their packet saying just the opposite. So if they really believe so, then why are they printing it? Just because the government forced them to do it. So maybe some products have to be listed as being risky and then removed out of the reach of any child to buy over the counter. If you don't do that, then let the parent take the responsibility and feed the child and purchase that thing, just like with other dangerous things. Now, we've consulted a doctor last night. If you eat Maggie raw for a year, like that, you are in serious, serious medical trouble. We are just suing the Indian government and patients J&J for faulty ball and socket joints. And there's a big argument of whether they'll pay and who is right and who is wrong. But it's another human rights case. But when they have children, these are some additional questions that we are forced to ask.
Thank you, Vera. May I turn the floor to Dheeraj? He will.
Just to add two more points in the Maggie case, like if you look at 6th June order that FSSAI passed, the Maggie representatives clearly said that product contained two parts, that is the noodle and the tastemaker. The samples had been tested for each of the two components separately, whereas it should have been tested as a combined end product. So company's contention was that FSSAI has, I will say, flawed testing techniques when it comes to, so, and when we look at the tastemaker also, it never gives separate warning in terms of consumption. So there's a clear violation in terms of labeling, I would say. On the MSG part, again, the company said that no added MSG on the label was on account of lack of clarity in the regulation, which you have clearly mentioned, and that the company had followed the practice generally followed by the industry in this behalf. So if we go to, it's a good exercise to do, because you all would also be aspiring to go into certain corporates to seek job. So it's always good to go to their websites and look at their investor section generally, because that is where they put all their policies and annual reports and disclosures. So Maggie in its, Nestle in its disclosure says that they follow all their global policies and standards. But when it comes to regulator issuing some notice, company has come to, on record they are stating we are following local practices. So that means company is not holding accountable to its own policies that they are stating generally that they follow. So another point regarding regulators having arm distance from government. Nestle is a unique case because Nestle has now collaborated with FSSAI to set up a food testing laboratory in Manesar. So where they have paid around 1 crore rupees to FSSAI to learn how to test these products. So it's a clear-cut case. So there are issues of complicity also that are there. So whenever we look at violations, we also need to look at violations also with background of complicity, with that how these forces are aligning when any such violation is in public. Also, I feel while discussing all these issues, we should also take this debate away from Maggie also to other products. Somehow, because Maggie is a very easy case to, I would say, look at, because there's a product, there's no clear labeling there, there's FSSAI coming into picture, issuing certain notices, and companies started disclosing that. Where if you look at Nestle website, you will feel it is one of the best, I will say, disclosures when it comes to any violation, because I have seen such violation only, such kind of disclosures only with Vedanta before this, when it was the Niyamgiri case. That was because amnesty was right on their head and they had to disclose that how they are performing vis-a-vis that violation. So therefore everything was disclosed. But Maggie, since the last judgment, there is no update on their website. Okay, from the last Supreme Court judgment where court said, okay, these samples are correct, now you can go back to your earlier case. They had asked for questioning the entire case itself. That was against, that is already filed in Consumer Judicial Authority also. So that is, if you see from that point onwards, even that particular instance has not been mentioned on their website yet. at least if you go to their website, I'm telling you all these things because I'm speaking more as a researcher. Because when we look at company disclosures, we need to go into company website and search at least. So I have around 20 web page links right now with me on which Maggie is disclosing different facts. So which are not, they could have made only one page for you and kept entire timeline all together, very easily readable information which you can read and understand as a consumer whether it's safe or not safe. But there are at least 20 pages that you have to go through. The only report that they have disclosed is from 2015 June onwards. There's one report that has been made public regarding lead presence. If company was testing their product, they could have made earlier reports also public. So because then as a stakeholder engagement, when violation was reported, company could have easily reached out to consumers for their feedback or what do they feel in this regard. But Maggie started with a hashtag campaign, I miss my Maggie campaign. That is Maggie's interaction with stakeholders through a hashtag campaign, which clearly states that you are missing it without knowing whether you miss it or not. Yeah, so company takes certain things for granted and they create a media narrative around those things. So when we are researching on any violation or any complexity case, we need to also see how public posturing is happening from company side. And until we do that, it's very difficult to understand those aspects. Also coming to aspect of looking at local chaiwala, in fact, with the present FSSAI head, FSSAI is saying that we will go and check all local eateries also in terms of their food standards. And which is also, if you look at, a lot has been written in public, like a lot is being written in media about how many big corporations like HUL, Nestle and Coke have come together to fund FSSAI to also push for certain systems to be ensured across board. So because they also want to kill certain markets, which are because in many times our narrative it seems as if Nestle is a victim, and to say that Nestle is a victim, we are we are asking for accountability for another layer which is not equipped at all for such measures to be placed on record or to have such standards in place. So there is also equity aspect that we need to see when we are engaging with businesses, because today when we look at, if we look at only because we are looking at disclosures of top 300 companies, it's around 5.5 million employees we are talking about. So these are not small players who are victims in this game. These are corporations who are bigger than many states altogether, and they have that kind of power to influence. So I'm just speaking in terms of lens that we can use in different analysis when we look at companies or their disclosures that can be brought into picture. So maybe we can.
Yeah. So
Can I just compliment you on your presentation? I have to go. This is rather good. I've been curious about why is it that tort law is very poorly developed in this country, and our Supreme Court seems to have some, acts on pangs of guilt. Before the emergency ADM Jabalpur, then pang of guilt, jurisprudence that opens up public interest litigation, then the Bhopal egregious settlement with Union Carbide, pang of guilt, Oleum gas leak case, a judgment that says if a company is making afford to pay, it should pay more. And none of this is jurisprudentially argued through and developed. It seems that you do something and then there's a reaction to it. So the evolution of law in this country seems to be rather haphazard, and I wish some of you guys would undertake a critical examination of this. So what's happened to the Oleum gas leak case? Did it have any repercussions? Has it ever been implemented anywhere else? That kind of thing, you know. So that's another part. But I find there's a serious lack of serious scholarship on tort law in the country. So.
Thanks, Dheeraj. Just not the same Maggie case, just for a moment, to illustrate that one of the most difficult human rights and business situations I was involved with was the attack on the Indian hotel, Taj Hotel, by terrorists. You have a narrative, but we also have a narrative that says so many lives were lost in that hotel. If there is an attack, the way I have looked at it, because I have colleagues there, I was in Bombay at the time, and I was in the Tata group. Not working in the Tata, was in the Tata group. But look at it another way. The state gets information about an attack on the right to life. I mean, okay. Whatever their coordination or the lack of coordination of our state, one, this threat is communicated to establishments in Bombay. That's a fact. Many hotels, not just the Taj, they were given. In fact, I was at Bandra that night and they even told us it was by sea. This much was known. Therefore, first thing, hotels were aware that there was a threat. How serious, how imminent is debatable. We don't have access to those communications. So the hotel knew. What does it then do? It does nothing till it's attacked. My suggestion in other places where we have done this and seen it done in other countries is the first thing you do from a human rights perspective is you inform your guests. Now, to inform your guests, why we don't have a HIV policy, we don't want panic. We don't want people to flee the hotel, and we don't want to lose business. Yeah, we're safe. Stay with us. So this was an assurance given to the unsuspecting guest that you are safe with us because nobody's told us otherwise. If I was the GM of that hotel, in the same group I would have written and talked to every single guest and told them you have a choice, you're welcome to stay and we'll make it as safe as we can. Or, if you are disturbed that the threat we have received is a sea hotel and you want to go inland somewhere near the airport, I will pay for that night and the choice is yours. Alright? Thirdly, I would have hired the best armed response in front of my gate and sealed off all the others till the period of that notice had evolved, and apologized to all incoming guests and out guests. Sorry, you have to go through unprecedented security for this. When none of this happens, and a handful of people are able to walk into Bombay and shoot at will, the narrative is exactly what David said. The company views itself as a victim, but a victim of what? A victim of a terrorist? No, it's a victim of poor law enforcement, poor intelligence and everything else. And people died in that hotel because nothing was done. There were no security steps. The terrorists, if they had seen 50 armed guards in front of a particular hotel and another one without any guard, would have gone to the hotel where there was not any guard. They wouldn't have shot it out where defense and was properly made safe, like in a safe installation. Now, from a human rights point of view, there's a right to information, and there is a right to my right to life, etc. Now, whether the government wrote this letter in the hospital, ultimately, I'm not staying with the government, I'm staying with the hotel. And could the hotel have done more to protect my life, or any guest's life there? And I do believe that, yes, absolutely it could have. And there are multiple examples we could give you. Human rights would mean the starting point of the discussion is not one guest will be harmed. I will evacuate them necessarily and keep the hotel empty till such time as it's safe to. Or I will put them up in another city or another hotel where there's no threat perception. But you can share this with your guests. Guests have been staying in war-torn zones all over the world when we go as journalists and we're staying in dangerous places. We know. But these are not those sort of guests. So the narrative of them being a victim means to me that this sort of thing can be repeated again. It can happen again. So it's not a security issue, and it's not an intelligence issue. It's a human rights issue that would say every human being is going to be 100% safe and nothing is going to happen, and I have done everything, including letting them know and giving you, most importantly, a choice. And that sharing that information in a mature way with. Now, if that had been done, we've debated this internally, we've had big fights, have been arguments about these things, but my group will not compromise its vision because we have seen in other situations where it has been prevented because of security, overtly and covertly right there. So I can't take responsibility for every hotel in Bombay, but I can take responsibility for my hotel and my guests. And this happened repeatedly. Then you see it's an industry attitude. So in this case, even if the state has informed, maybe the state should have enforced the security, but I'm still talking what could have the company done irrespective of all this. And did the guest have therefore a right to know and a choice? And could other things have been done possibly to even save 5 and 10 lives, even after the first hour? But is business and occupancy is going to come first? Then you'll get what you get. This is what human rights actually hopes to reverse. It's hard. These examples are not easy to talk about, but they are true, and they are worthy of another narrative and another interpretation as well.
So before the focus group to seek input start, I mean, there are two sort of faculty members here who are specialized in business and human rights. Do you want to say? Any one of you want to say something quickly on either the NAP or the Maggie or both? So, Malvika?
I would actually want to quickly respond to the presentation.
Sure.
The idea that you cannot cast responsibility on the corporations, this idea is long gone. It used to be a really, really old discussion and it is now over. Why you can cast responsibility on corporations of this nature and of this magnitude is that forget about the turnover that they have. So I'm not even going to go into money and the resources that they have. Consider solely the influence that they have. Influence on governments. Very simple example, I'm sure a lot of you here are aware of the fact that Coca-Cola is called Coke because they used to mix cocaine in it. And this was a part of United States drug policy and how their trade with Peru used to function and how it allowed Coke to continue to get that product because it influenced the policy at that time. This is a really old discussion that I'm bringing into the picture, which is to show that these corporations have immense power. There are countries at present which do not, either they are not able, just because the rule of law is not strong enough, implementation mechanisms are not in place, or they are just not willing. So there are countries which would happily just engage with the corporation, higher officials will just take bribes and corruption will be rampant, and they will make sure that the regulatory mechanisms are very, very low for the corporations to function effectively. In such a scenario, an international community cannot sit back and cannot be silent and hope for the country to govern with respect to everything. Even the voluntary principles do cast a primary responsibility on the state, but that primary responsibility has to be met by, after that, there is something that we are looking at the corporations, we are looking at them as well to regulate themselves, and like Professor Sudarshan had mentioned, that as consumers and investors, if we have this information that we are trying to discuss right now, this information unfortunately, like Mr. Leader mentioned, actually is not easily available. So we don't really know which corporations are in the wrong and what they are essentially doing. So any kind of a national action plan, according to me, should really focus on this reporting as well and make it accessible to the consumers and to the investors. So, and there are models which are in existence as of now in terms of ethical rating systems, lists that are released, reports that are released, which are rating the corporations in terms of how they are functioning. These things, if they are released to the consumers, may have an impact on consumer behavior, and consumer behavior definitely has had a very strong impact on corporations' behavior. I wouldn't want to take more time, and I want my students to just want to.
So could you introduce yourself, Malvika?
My name is Malvika Singh, and I'm an assistant professor here at the law school. This is in fact my first time when I'm floating in the lecture on law, business and human rights, which was my area of interest in my master's.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Malvika, for your own presence, for your students' presence.
Yeah, I'm
really,
sure my students must have had an interesting session, and I hope that they will participate.
Very much appreciate. Thank you so much. Sanjini, do you have any quick comments?
I just have a comment to make in response to what you said, Daniel.
Could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sanjini. I'm a research associate at the law school. So my response is that very specifically when you're comparing a terrorist which enters the boundary of India, you can as well compare to an investor which is coming to India. So the state there is acting as one of the parties to a contract. So one of the very important things which I think probably the NAP should look at is drafting socially responsible contracts. United Nations has come up with guidelines on that because that's your starting point even for somebody at the end of the supply chain, even if you're going to a public interest litigation. Yeah. The first point of for any lawyer also is a contract. And I have specific problems with the dispute resolution clauses which exist in these contracts. To take a discussion, in the United States specifically, you have the Federal Arbitration Act, where the mandatory arbitration agreements are per se not void, right? But you see recent cases of Facebook and Uber actually going on to say that, okay, the mandatory arbitration clause in sexual harassment claims was wrong. And that was because of a lobbying which took place amongst the employers. So my point is, you were also talking about forecasting the law. In India, it is not such a big issue as of now, but I suspect it might be considering how much focus and presence ADR is gaining very quickly. So if you also look at Rule 81A of the Industrial Dispute Act, you make conciliation a mandatory requirement in respect to labor disputes. So my point is that for a state, it's fine to have these guidelines well and good. But what actually happens when an investor is coming in, which is almost similar to a terrorist entering your country? Your investor is absolutely acting in a similar manner. So you have these ESG indicators, whether they are violating that or not. So I think some focus should be given to drafting socially responsible contracts. You already have the OHCHR which has come up with guidelines, extensive lengthy guidelines. So that is something which I think that could be taken into account as a state, or as what India as a state could do in respect of protecting the rights of its citizens.
What type of contracts? You mean only international trade contracts with other things, or even, for example, the debate about public procurement? The way the government sources goods could be given a human rights lens just from private suppliers that they are compliant with national law, right, in respect to, say, child labor, for example.
My focus is very specific on investors.
Investors.
Yeah, that's because the amount of investment which is coming in now with the present government, okay, you just cannot evade the sort of human rights issues they are bringing up. It's let's say grabbing of land, displacement, whether they are being given adequate compensation or not. It brings in multitude of issues which come up. So my focus is very specific in investor-state contracts, but it might as well apply to any contract, even for a company if it's going entering into a contract, so let's say a consumer.
The United Kingdom became the first country to have an NAP, right? National Action Plan. Then it reviewed it. One of the actions that came out of the National Action Plan was an act, NSA Act, Modern Slavery Act. And the Modern Slavery Act, you're welcome to react to UK lecturing all of us about slavery, but behoves Indian companies doing business with the UK to give a modern slavery statement signed by the board to ensure to the UK that in the supply chain of that company there is no modern slavery, which in our language is forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, involuntary labor, or trafficked persons, etc. So the compliance that an Indian company is already required by law, and this is the UK, the Dutch are doing similar things as the French and the Germans and others as well.
Just one last response.
Yeah.
The problem with Modern Slavery Act is that when you're talking about what are the legal implications that they don't respond to
Yes.
that, at maximum what happens is that they have this person who's appointed in the High Court, they just have to report to the High Court, and after that there is no punitive measure which is actually coming on the company.
Not yet.
So yeah, not yet. It might come up in the future, so possibly if we are looking at incorporating something like that in the NAP, we might as well include some punitive measure, because otherwise I don't see a case for businesses to actually, apart from let's say reputational measures or like such reasons, to actually go on and disclose voluntarily. Secondly, in Nestle has a huge human rights due diligence strategy program if you look at their global website. And they give you option of, if you have any compliance concerns, you can actually go and directly contact them. The problem again there is that Nestle as a company is focusing very specifically on supply chain of cocoa. And that could be because it's a Western countries, cocoa is consumed much more than Nestle. So what we could possibly as India do is that we could talk about regional products which are important to our country, which might not be important to Nestle as a global as a transnational corporation, but it might be specific to India. So if you actually go onto their website, it is doing a lot of work in child labor along in consultation with the US Department of Agriculture to tackle that problem. If something similar happens for Maggie, maybe we see a different outcome there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sanjini. So, Chuki is trying to type as fast as possible, as you can see.
It was an interesting discussion, so I
Yeah.
really wanted to make sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to now, do the focus group and a larger audience, not at the core, but
Yeah.
at the periphery?
Yeah, I can do that. So what I'll do is I will not take too much of your time. I know there's an evening waiting for everybody. So I'll just take about 15-20 minutes. Without getting into discussion about what I think there's a whole lot of knowledge that's already there in this table, and I've tried to capture as much as possible. It was an excellent presentation, and the information was really, it was innovative in terms of the fact that you have arguments to counter a NAP is also necessary to build a NAP. Okay, so I think it's really great. So just to kind of take you through some discussions around, business and human rights, I'll just kind of talk about some very popular narratives and just want your reactions on these narratives. Okay, whether they violate human rights or not violate human rights, what are your feelings, what are the human rights that could be violated because of these popular narratives, is what I'm actually looking at. Yeah.
So as Junki does this, because this particular portion has been very silent, I would actually prioritize, if you raise your hands, to get inputs from you, and they'll come to the center of the table, okay? Because it's youth consultation, so we have to include it.
So this is the first narrative that actually is very, very relevant in the Indian context, with the no offenses to the government anywhere, but yes. Focus on growth. If there is no growth, what will you redistribute? Just your reactions.
You just raise your hand and I can...
Could you repeat that?
Focus on growth. If there is no growth, what will you redistribute?
I don't know, I just feel like with this narrative there's always like a dichotomy that's created between growth and between the rights of individuals. Like there seems to be this assumption that any development and economic growth has to come at the cost of the rights of individuals, which I don't think necessarily is the case. I think that these things are a lot more complex, and you can take incremental measures which do ensure certain basic rights to individuals, but at the same time ensure development and economic growth in particular areas. So for instance, forced labor, despite the fact that or child labor, for instance, you can ensure that these companies are employing proper labor. They won't go into a loss because of that, They won't withdraw from it, but you still not being forced to work in these places. Like it's just that because companies will always go for their own interest, which is to minimize their costs, like there's a balance that can be struck between letting them make profits and therefore come into our country, give employment to people, create jobs, things like that, but at the same time also not exploit people. So I really think that narrative is always oversimplified and suffers from like these problematic assumptions that are made, which don't necessarily need to be.
Thank you very much. Could you introduce yourself? I mean, so anyone who's sort of, please introduce yourself and the program that you come from.
I'm Pratik, I'm part of the 3 LLB course.
LLB course. Right. Thanks.
Any other reactions?
Maybe you can go to your next question.
Ma'am, what type of growth are we talking about here?
Economic.
Economic growth. So, I mean, the question would be if the growth is constant, it's not increasing or the growth has stopped. So, what the state should do? I mean, the extreme case would be Venezuela. Either it could become that situation, or it could become a situation like USA where the growth is pretty minimum and constant at 1% or 1.5% to 2% of GDP. But that doesn't change the avenues and the opportunities that are available. I mean, it's just sustaining. If you're not growing, that doesn't mean that you're not sustainable. You can still sustain. So it means that agriculture has been contributing like 20% to the GDP, but has been consuming like majority of the human capital. If we can just readjust that, maybe we can get the growth back on track, because maybe we are not looking for the right avenues for growth. So it would be remodifying our present set of skills, and I think it will never become a situation or an issue.
So next.
So the next is, we have been growing very fast, true. But if you shift the focus on redistribution, growth will get affected.
Introduce yourself, please, and the program.
I'm Yash, LLB from the law school. So, on a very similar lines to what Pratik said, we have been growing really fast, but if we take redistribution into consideration, then the growth will be affected. But we have to look at growth holistically. Like if you're leaving a large chunk of people behind who are affected, who are vulnerable and who are being violated, then what is the growth of a certain corporation or a certain elite group of people useful for? There should not be an increase in disparity between who are growing and who are actually being deteriorated. So that is what you need to take into consideration.
A person is putting money, it is ethical and imperative if we ensure returns for him.
In other words, maximize return on
Yeah.
investment.
So the idea here is basically a person is trying to say that irrespective of what the company is doing, the only agenda of the business should be to maximize returns for the shareholders.
So I'm here from the final stand.
No, talk about your name. I mean,
Anisha, and I'm a second year law student of the BA LLB program.
briefly, what's the final stand about?
So the final stand is a group. A couple of us are here. There's Arpan, there's Rahul, and there's me, and there's also Sudarshan. And so we're a group of law students, and we're trying to basically create a legislation to do something about climate change in India. Because as of now, we feel that the present environmental legislations don't do enough to protect the country's environment or effectively deal with the climate change in legislative capacity. To answer your question, I feel that most of these arguments are actually put forward by very elite groups and by corporations very often to say that we want to maximize returns and we want to maximize profits and so on and so forth. It comes from an ideology where which has a premise, on its premise that of unbridled growth and of the fact that we can continue developing and forever, right? But I think now we've started to see that that's really not true, and we've started to see that it's actually harming the planet and it's harming communities at large. In countries like in India, although the 1991 reforms did bring about a lot of positive changes, but they also have now shown that they brought about a great amount of inequalities in the country. So I believe like that's something that needs to be taken into account. I think as one of the people already mentioned that if growth is only benefiting a small number of individuals and actually being harmful to a large number of other individuals, that's no growth.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself and the program that you come from.
I'm Pranav from LLM. And my point is like, from government perspective, the growth will be, economic growth will be source of revenue. But take a case of a food industry. If a corporation is selling a product which is harmful for certain people, like take a case of caffeine consumption. There are studies that which says that a person should not consume more than certain amount of caffeine. But there are cafes who are serving in a single serving they are like in a single serving product they have more than that limit. So in that case, what health impact will that have on that person, and the price burden which will fall into the government to make sure their population is healthy, we should also take into that account when we are talking about growth, the negative aspects of growth, overconsumption.
Thank you very much.
So my name is Sudarshan. I'm the first year of LLB and I'm also the part of financial initiative. What I would like to throw my insight on is that we are not able to define, we are defining growth in terms of financial terms only. We are not looking at the human aspect and the human development aspect as far as the happiness is concerned, because we are in the world of having, every country is having the happiness index report. And I also wanted to reiterate that we are not looking at there are major corporations, they are selling products and we all are consuming in our daily life, such as Coke or certain sodas, and the amount of sugar that they are having is it is more than the required amount for the body. And just like Coke says it's just 9 grams per 100 ml, and we say that okay, I'm having 500 ml. So we don't actually visualize how much is 50 grams, milligrams or grams, and how much is actually, and it was really shocking for me to see that the amount, it's very easy to drink 500 ml of sugar soda, and we don't realize. So I think that it should be important warning on every product that sells sugary items that this is dangerous, and the limit that should be reiterated that this can cause you diabetes in this number of years, because like we have advertisement for smoking. So here basically what we are doing is we are maximizing the, like you can say, marginal utility of the person, like the utility which the person consumes and gets, maximizing on that, and we are comparing it with the profit standard, due to which we are not focusing on the health issues. And I think this is also a violation of human rights.
Just on the economic thing, just a quick comment. Isn't the case that improvement is possible when the economics start increasingly internalizing all these externalized costs? 10 years ago, everybody bought coal-fired power because the economics showed it was the cheapest form of energy. Today, we know that solar energy is really cheaper than that because coal has had to internalize costs of displacement of people, pollution, and so forth. So the word economic itself, I think maybe the group feels that there is hope that most of these costs are yet shown as externalized costs. Somebody else has to bear them, the people who are weakest disabled, the people who don't use cars, automobiles, or and ride cycles out of the world. But if that cost of energy becomes truly reflective of human rights and social environmental things, then you get a sort of market transformation that allows lower cost and cleaner energies to do what they're doing today. The big argument of the coal companies was, we will not internalize a single of these costs, and they've been forced to.
But if it is, so just a quick point, so if it is not internalized into these products, then what happens? It creates conflict. And conflict plays a very important role as creating a cost for the company. So very easily, I would say that there is a business case that can actually be made in terms of internalizing, not just for CSR, but for your strategic business moves, all internalizing certain human rights rights.
So we learn about negative and positive business cases. So basically,
What's your name, please?
I'm Mustan and I'm a fourth-year law student.
Thank you, Mustan.
And the idea here is that when we look at human rights as a very short-term approach and just look at how not adhering to human rights is actually profitable for a business, then you ignore the fact that in the long term it's actually better for the business. In the short term, the business is going to suffer a lot of things like reputational harm, like the public losing trust in them, like with Mac. But in the long term, like with Unilever, the business actually gets a lot of legitimacy and it works out well for them. So there's a problem in the way that we're framing this question also, because we're saying that the cost of human rights protection is the business losing out profits, which is not true.
Excuse me. I have a last point to make regarding this question. Now, if you look at the palm oil industry that's there in Indonesia, right, they have destroyed about 80% of the rainforests in our country. And Indonesia is a country which allowed this to happen because there is massive corruption and the government officials have blatantly ignored the cost. So the thing is that when you look at the cost that is incurred, it's not just the economic cost, right? There are a lot of environmental human rights costs involved with it. And I think, I don't know if you're a part of the government or not, but
Always best to ask.
what I'm trying to suggest is that it's important that corporations and governments now start changing their policies in a fashion that's actually conducive to not just growth and profits, but also a very holistic ideology and a very holistic idea of growth, where people, communities, indigenous communities, and the environment is benefited.
My name is Karan Arora. I'm a fourth-year law student. And I'm currently writing a paper on how extractive industries have focused on a reactive approach to conflicts and the costs that arise from conflicts, and how they should actually be using a more proactive approach. And my question there is that how, if the extractive industry has been unable to actually gauge the cost of conflict, how they still find it difficult to understand how merely reacting to a certain conflict or with a local community, etc., can actually cause more harm in the long run. And if they were to proactively, work on this, on a kind of engagement with the local community from the get-go, how this would save them a lot of money. And this is like study by the PNAS, which is the proceedings of the National Academy of Science in the US, where they saw that an industry with an annual income of roughly $20 to $30 million would suffer annual losses of nearly $3 to $4 million merely because of temporary delays and temporary halts in their operations. And how they always have to react to this. They never foresee these conflicts happening, always having a reactive approach once the conflict is arisen. So I think that's one thing that physicists need to focus on, which is being a lot more proactive in terms of looking at conflict.
We could be cynical here, I think many of them caused the conflict. And look at the security industry, they thrive on it. So when there is conflict, they tell the mining companies you need new guards, you need new cameras, and they actually thrive on conflict. But if you're talking what type of conflict, there are two at least. I've worked in mining, and one is where there is genuine civil conflict. Take the case of when Jharkhand was being born out of Bihar. And that was a dramatic case because you did not know, mining companies were there, whether they were welcome, what's going to happen in the new state. But the conflict was largely between North and South and equity that led. But the second conflict is the conflict that arises out of corporate practices, mining companies, which are pollution, water, lack of access, lack of jobs, etc. So there was a conflict caused by the company, and there is a conflict where it may be even caused by the state or exasperated by the state, where the state arms, for example, people in villages, as you know. And the company may be complicit in that type of state action For example, a company might say that we have conflict and people are protesting, so huge force is used, the police battalion is used, and the company had asked for that, or at least complicit in that. So it depends on what type of conflict. If they have caused it themselves and they're benefiting from the conflict, they also do this. They create false conflict to keep two parties fighting with each other in the villages and the community, divide and rule sort of thing, that makes it easier for the mining company. The problem today is that maybe 30 years ago, it was possible to say this mine is responsible, that mine 12 kilometers away is not. Today it's come to a situation where all mining companies are paying to the same, but it's hard to distinguish yourself. You can't be a little island of human rights and environmental excellence when everything else around you is raging fire. So the question is now also emerging about the responsibility of that business sector, like mining, as opposed to just talking about Rio Tinto or one mining company in the public sector, this individual company. Because it seems to us that the issues are across all mining companies' conflict. Nobody's exempt, so the analysis, shouldn't we rather spending time teaching one company how to manage conflict or not proactively say, or should it be a whole sectoral thing? And what we're finding is that many of these human rights obligations, some are, the company says this is mine and mine alone, irrespective of what another company does. And in certain cases, like say the use of migrant labor, it's too big for me to handle and make a difference. I've got to do this as a business sector. There are different challenges in competitors collaborating. When they reduce risk together, they collaborate. But the minute benefits come on the scene, then they go individually again and stop sharing these again. Thank you for your submission.
So you had just mentioned the statement that the whole motive of a business is just to make profits, etc. So you had mentioned that the world, like the international community, is like really struggling to make an internationally binding treaty where you can have transnational cooperation at the forefront. To me, that is very surprising because you see there's a certain hegemony in the Western legal system. In that, transnational corporations can sue countries, etc., for their property rights and stuff like as far as their material interests are concerned. And they are subjects of international law under that, like international dispute settlement procedures. Now, from that, it logically follows that if you are operating in a country where you're also violating human rights, why cannot you take that corporation to court or perhaps under international law? I mean, if you look at it, theoretical obstacles do not exist anymore where you can say that a transnational corporation cannot be liable under international law. So, in that sense, I just feel that the statement that the motive of a business is just to do business, like just to make money, it doesn't make sense to me. Because as far as their interests are concerned, that's all okay, even under international law. But when you come to human rights, it doesn't exist. And on that point, I feel that this has been this way since the start. They had mentioned that I call it a not a state syndrome, where you say that it's protection of human rights is a state responsibility. So we call non-government organization, non-state actors. So in that, I think we get sort of confused as to who is sort of responsible. But I feel that we've established that transnational corporations, because of their sort of colossal corpus of funds, they can do whatever they want. So on that basis, I feel that there is a case for human rights. Even at the Dumbarton Oaks proposal, after the Second World War, it was the NGOs in San Francisco because of whom the idea of an individual being protected under international law actually came into place. It was drafted in a very wide manner. But I feel this is the point to sort of start. And I believe that, slowly through different mechanisms, we can get to a point where we can have transnational corporations liable under international.
So I'll just give you two more statements. Right? Do not talk against company malpractices in India, especially bonded labor or modern forms of slavery. It will blemish our country. The investors and importers will run away. Maintaining balance of trade is important.
Anyone wishing to react to this?
Give one more. Okay, one more. I'm from an affluent business family. So what? Being from such a family, I have access to various networks built by my family. Just because I'm born affluent, I should not be deprived of any right to equal opportunity.
So regarding the first one,
Introduce yourself, please.
so my name is Arthur and I'm part of Student Activist Group, One Final Stand, and second Students for Peace. So Students for Peace is a group committed to promote awareness regarding political, social issues that our society concerns. So on the statement that you recently made, what I feel is multinational companies are well aware of the malpractices that are going on in the country, right? There is bonded labor, there is child labor. What multinational companies don't look at is what they are losing out on the local level. So for example, if a multinational company with complicity with not only the state but the international banking institutions such as the WTO, what they try to do is at the local level they try to create a sort of image that jobs are being created, the students will receive education. The problem here is when they act in compliance with when they don't act in compliance with the existing laws in India, plus the guidelines which bodies such as UN put forward. The problem I find with these multinational companies is that they don't look at what they are harming at the local level. They are not only harming the communities at the local level, such as indigenous communities as Isha referred to, but also they are harming at a larger scale the environment. So my focus whenever I talk about human rights is where do human rights flow from? Not only from the state, but from the natural resources. So if we are talking about defective products time and again, but what about the food we eat, the water we drink and the air we breathe? All is qualified food, and who is responsible for this? Not only we as individuals, but these very multinational companies. So when you hold multinational when you are talking about human rights violations of these multinational companies, the stakeholders are not only the communities and the individuals, but also the environment. You talk when you someone referred to all this process as a contract, like when a multinational company is coming to India, it is a contract between the state and the individual is a party to that contract. But where is the environment? So first of all, before you talk about human rights, you have to look at rights of the nature. Where are rights of nature? So for that, what you need to do is first take into account the inequity that is existing in India. One of the narratives you referred to was regarding growth, right? Growth and why regarding maximizing returns, right? The problem with that is we are using wrong metrics. For example, someone referred to GDP and per capita income. That is, those are wrong metrics solely because of the inequity in India. We live in a country where 1% of the population holds 70% of the wealth. So how are these metrics even feasible to use at first place? So, and lastly regarding growth. So yeah, somebody made a dichotomy between growth, economic growth and individual growth. The problem here is when you talk about economic growth, you are basically confusing it with development. So whenever the state is talking about growth, it refers to development, that for development you need growth. Again the problem comes back to wrong metrics of GDP and per capita income. So first you need to define what growth is for you. Is $5 trillion economy a move towards growth, or sustaining or redistributing the very resources which we have right now? That is growth for you. So I feel defining terms such as growth, development, that is necessary in order to move forward to a world where we can talk about human rights and environment in particular.
So the last, because of the constraints of time and some people have to rush to class, the last from the student community, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Nikha. I'm in the NMM. I like to point out to this fact, I like to merge the two narratives and say that if you only concentrate on the upper middle class or the rich affluent sections, we are not talking about growth as a holistic concept as one pointed out. We are also to consider the poor, the indigenous population who are basically moving on to the other extreme of the radar. We should concentrate on building a collective consciousness where everything is taken into consideration in the global sphere. There are not only non-state actors, transnational corporations or states.
there are also tribals, there are also poor people who are basically making ends meet, and their monthly income is lesser than what we spend once on a shopping spree. So till the time we don't realize as affluent sections our extra responsibility that we have in this globalized world, I don't think that we'll be able to counter this particular narrative. Actually, we'll actually foster this narrative even further. So that's it.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate all your participation. I, as an educator, we as educators, we can't sort of have more of an engaged kind of a audience as compared to this. And I think the entire thing was catalyzed by Practices and PIC. I wanted to come and engage with all of you, and I basically leaping on that universe, on that opportunity. And they're bringing all their perspectives, all their experience, and the presentation team. I'd like to basically give you a real sort of appreciative kind of, because you worked on the weekend when Bispa Wheel was going on, and you showed an exemplary sort of initiative of student engagement, and then you actually led the other students to engage with this very sort of important, evolving policy in the country, very important topic. So I really thank also our guests, Virat, Chunki and Dheeraj, for taking the time, for wanting to come down all the way to Sonipat to basically engage with the student community. I thank the faculty members here, like Professor Malvika said, to bring her students, for showing such a proactive engagement. Really sort of, I can't thank my colleagues who are the photographers, who are the videographers, always sort of their hard work, and thank you very much once again. And very quick if you can. Yeah, very quick if you can.
Regarding the second last statement, where a government should not increase their labor standards, I would say in a shorter run, they might be able to have benefits of like getting more investments and reducing the trade deficit. But on a longer run, they will fall short of talent who can run the businesses, and the organization might not be interested in having their manufacturing and units there because of the lack of talent.
Thank you very much, and so we draw formally a close to this consultation and this engagement session. Once again, thank you very much, and there's some refreshments which are now steadily getting cold. So please, if you could just grab whatever you want to, and then let's sort of go back to your own lives. And Dheeraj has kept some corporate. I was actually there at the launch of this report, and I would totally recommend that you pick up a copy if you can. Whatever lasts. And it's a very sort of critical look at the state of the industry, and very well done. So all this is there for your consumption. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.